On the morning of June 6, 1944, a 20-year-old German soldier named Heinrich Zevelo looked out from the concrete embrasure of Widerstandsnest 62 at Omaha Beach. Below him, the meticulously planned American amphibious assault was disintegrating into chaos, unfolding exactly as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had engineered. By 8 a.m., armored support had sunk to the bottom of the channel, and the shoreline was already a graveyard of burning landing craft. According to every metric of the Atlantic Wall's design, the defense had triumphed, and the invasion had categorically failed. So, what went wrong? To answer that, we have to look at the morning of June 6th from the reverse perspective, looking down from inside the reinforced concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall. For the first critical hours of the invasion, the German defenders genuinely believed they had won. Their interlocking fields of machine gun fire and pre-sighted artillery barrages were functioning with devastating mechanical efficiency, completely dominating the shoreline. The massive Allied naval and aerial bombardment designed to pulverize these very positions had overshot the bluffs, leaving the German fortifications almost entirely intact. Down at the water's edge, the American operational timetable had collapsed within minutes. Assault troops were pinned behind the shingle, stripped of their armor, heavy weapons, and centralized command. From the vantage point of the defenders looking through the narrow embrasures, it was merely a matter of waiting for the rising tide to finish the job. This presents one of the most compelling paradoxes of the Second World War. If the static defenses of Omaha Beach operated exactly as designed, if the pre-invasion bombardment failed to neutralize them, and if the initial American assault wave disintegrated upon contact, how did a seemingly doomed, paralyzed invasion force transform into a fatal breach of Hitler's impenetrable fortress? The foundation of that German confidence was carved directly into the geology of the Normandy coastline. To understand why the Atlantic Wall was so lethal in this specific sector, you must recognize that Omaha Beach was not merely a fortified strip of sand. It was a naturally occurring kill zone. Stretching for 5 miles, the shoreline forms a gentle, concave crescent. This topography naturally funneled incoming landing craft and infantry inward, boxing them into a concentrated area. Behind the narrow strip of tidal flattened shingle, the terrain rises abruptly into steep, commanding bluffs, reaching up to 150 feet in height. This natural wall was unbroken except for 5 narrow ravines, or draws, leading inland toward the villages of Vieilleville, Saint-Laurent, and Colville. German engineers understood immediately that they did not need to line every inch of the beach with infantry. To control the shore, they only needed to transform these 5 draws into heavily fortified, impassable choke points. They achieved this through a system of interlocking strongpoints known as Widerstandsnester, or resistance nests. 15 of these heavily armed complexes overlooked Omaha, operating not as isolated pillboxes, but as an engineered, integrated network. Widerstandsnest 62, the position occupied by Heinrich Zevelo, sat on a dominant ridge covering the eastern half of the beach and the critical Colville draw. The tactical genius of these nests lay in their geometry. The heavy machine guns and anti-tank cannons were not aimed straight out at the English Channel. Instead, they were angled horizontally, parallel to the shoreline. This created a devastating effect known as enfilade fire. As American infantry waded ashore, they were not facing the muzzles directly. Rather, the gunfire tore horizontally through their exposed flanks. A single MG-42, firing up to 1,200 rounds a minute, could sweep across the beach, creating a wall of lead that interlocked perfectly with the arc of fire from the neighboring strongpoint. Artillery pieces, ranging from 50mm guns to 75mm cannons, were pre-registered to specific grid squares on the sand below. The defenders did not have to actively aim through the morning mist and smoke. They simply had to pull the lanyard when the enemy entered a predetermined coordinate. The lethality of this geometric trap was vastly magnified by a critical failure in Allied intelligence. Planners in London believed the Omaha sector was held by the 716th Infantry Division, a static coastal defense unit primarily composed of older conscripts and troops recovering from previous wounds. But in the spring of 1944, the German High Command quietly reinforced the sector, moving elements of the 352nd Infantry Division directly into the coastal fortifications. Allied reconnaissance completely missed this shift. The 352nd was a fundamentally different caliber of adversary, containing a core of battle-hardened veterans who had survived the grueling, high-intensity combat of the Eastern Front. They understood strict fire discipline, knew how to manage ammunition constraints under pressure, and possessed the psychological resilience to function through massive bombardments. When the landing craft dropped their ramps, the Americans stepped into a defense force that was effectively double the anticipated size and vastly superior in combat experience. From the outside, looking up from the blood-stained surf, this defensive machinery appeared flawless. It was operating exactly as designed. Yet, hidden beneath the reinforced concrete and the disciplined crossfire, the German defensive doctrine contained a fatal structural fragility. The entire strategy, forcefully championed by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was predicated on a single, uncompromising doctrine. The invasion had to be annihilated in the water. The beaches were not considered the front line. They were the main line of resistance. Rommel firmly believed that if the Allies ever secured a beachhead, their overwhelming aerial and material superiority would make them unstoppable. Therefore, nearly all available firepower and tactical focus were pushed directly to the cliff edge. This philosophy created a highly rigid system with zero defense in depth. The Widerstandsnester were static islands, deeply reliant on a vulnerable network of buried telephone wires to communicate with inland artillery batteries and battalion command posts. As the sheer chaos of the morning unfolded, and as naval shells occasionally found their marks on the bluffs, these fragile communication lines were severed. Without active communications, the centralized German command structure began to fragment, leaving individual bunkers to fight isolated, disconnected battles. Furthermore, because the doctrine demanded that the enemy be destroyed at the water's edge, operational reserves were problematic. Mobile forces, like the 352nd Division's Kampfgruppe Meyer, were stationed miles inland. Their strict standing orders were to wait for clear directives from division command before committing to a counterattack to plug a gap. But without accurate, real-time information flowing up from the blinded coastal strongpoints, higher command remained paralyzed, unsure of exactly where the main threat was developing. The rigid doctrine left almost no room for localized, tactical initiative by these reserve commanders. The Atlantic Wall at Omaha Beach was a masterclass in static defense, leveraging geography, engineering, and veteran troops to create a seemingly impenetrable barrier. The Germans had set the perfect trap, betting the entire outcome of the war in the West on this narrow strip of sand. However, their ultimate victory depended entirely on one fragile assumption. It required the Americans to behave exactly according to the invasion plan, to remain paralyzed in the predetermined kill zones, and to die on the beach. For the first devastating hour, reality strictly adhered to that German assumption. The intricate American timetable disintegrated the moment the landing craft ramps dropped. This was intended to be a tightly choreographed sequence of specialized demolition teams clearing coastal obstacles, immediately followed by infantry securing the designated draws under the cover of amphibious tanks. Instead, the English Channel swallowed the armor. Vicious tidal currents pushed landing craft hundreds of yards off their assigned sectors, scrambling the meticulously organized assault waves into disorganized, intermingled clusters. The heavy radios required to coordinate the assault were mostly at the bottom of the sea or short-circuited by salt water. Crucially, the rigid American command hierarchy was rapidly dismantled in the surf. Company commanders, lieutenants, and senior non-commissioned officers, the men who carried the operational blueprints in their heads, were disproportionately targeted by German gunners or lost in the initial crossfire. Stripped of leadership, communication, and heavy weapons, the survivors hurled themselves behind a narrow embankment of shingle stone, utterly paralyzed. Looking down from the concrete embrasures, the German defenders saw an enemy that had ceased to function as a cohesive military machine. By every conventional tactical metric, the invasion was suffocating in the sand. But this total collapse of the top-down American blueprint triggered an unintended structural consequence for the German defense. The rigid mechanics of the Atlantic Wall were meticulously engineered to repel a structured, predictable military operation. The interlocking fields of fire were specifically calibrated to annihilate organized platoons attempting to force their way up the heavily defended ravines. The system was never designed to fight a highly decentralized, unpredictable swarm of desperate individuals who had completely abandoned the invasion playbook. With the official plan in ruins, a terrifying clarity washed over the surviving combat engineers and infantrymen pinned against the seawall. The officers supposed to issue orders were gone. The command structure was a fiction. The grim calculation was absolute. Remaining on the beach meant certain death, and retreating into the tide meant drowning under the weight of waterlogged gear. Survival demanded an immediate, radical shift, from military obedience to localized, ruthless initiative. The rigid execution of a massive amphibious assault fractured into dozens of isolated, intensely personal battles for survival. Small, leaderless groups of 3, 5, or 10 men, often strangers from entirely different regiments, began to realize they had only one direction left to move. Slowly, ignoring the heavily defended draws they were originally ordered to secure, these fragmented bands turned their attention upward. They stopped fighting as a synchronized army and began probing the steep, smoke-obscured bluffs between the German strongpoints, searching for microscopic cracks in the impenetrable concrete wall. Inside the concrete confines of Widerstandsnest 62, the shifting dynamic of the battle was not immediately apparent, but it was beginning to manifest in the physical mechanics of the defense. From the perspective of Heinrich Zevelo and the garrison commanded by Lieutenant Bernhard Frerking, the initial hours of the invasion were a period of terrifying, unrelenting execution of their defensive doctrine. The geometry of their interlocking fields of fire was functioning flawlessly, but the sheer, unprecedented scale of the assault was beginning to strain the limits of their equipment. The primary instrument of this defense was the MG-42 machine gun, a weapon of devastating efficiency, capable of cycling up to 1,200 rounds a minute. However, this staggering rate of fire came with an intense mechanical cost. Sustained firing generated extreme, localized heat. Within seconds of pulling the trigger, the steel barrel of the machine gun would shift from a dark, cold gray to a dull, radiating cherry red. The weapon was specifically engineered to account for this thermal stress, featuring a quick-change barrel mechanism. But executing this maneuver under the immense psychological pressure of a massive amphibious assault was an entirely different reality. The gunner or his assistant had to slap the release latch, carefully extract the searing hot steel using a specialized thick asbestos pad to avoid instantly melting the skin off their palms, slide a fresh, cool barrel into the heavily machined housing, and slam the receiver shut to resume firing. This frantic, mechanized choreography had to be repeated constantly, over and over, as the spent brass casings piled up in massive, shifting brass dunes on the floor of the bunker. The air inside the concrete casemate grew thick and suffocating, choking the defenders with the acrid, metallic stench of vaporized machine oil, burnt cordite, and human sweat. More pressing than the thermal limits of the weapons was the grim mathematics of ammunition management. The Atlantic Wall bunkers had been stockpiled with tens of thousands of rounds, a seemingly inexhaustible supply intended to last through a prolonged siege. But the defensive planners had never accounted for the sheer density of human targets that the Allied naval armada was aggressively feeding into the surf zone. The wooden crates of belted ammunition were being cracked open and drained at an unsustainable velocity. A chilling, mechanical anxiety began to creep into the minds of the defenders. They were executing their orders perfectly. The machine guns were operating exactly as designed, yet the landing craft simply kept coming. The water was filled with men. The realization slowly dawned on the isolated gun crews that despite their tactical advantage, their weapons might physically melt down. or their ammunition bunkers might run completely dry, long before the enemy ran out of men to throw at the shoreline. The static defense was performing its grim task, but it was being slowly ground down by the sheer, overwhelming friction of the American numbers. Down on the water's edge, amidst this unrelenting hail of plunging fire, the survival of the American invasion no longer relied on grand strategic maneuvers or armored support. It came down to a few scattered, desperate individuals and a highly specific piece of demolition equipment: the Bangalore torpedo. The German defensive engineers had lined the shingle bank with dense, overlapping barriers of concertina wire. This was not merely a fence. It was a deeply layered, three-dimensional trap designed to snag clothing, entangle equipment, and hold the attacking infantry in the precise coordinates of the pre-registered artillery kill zones. To move off the beach and access the bluffs, this wire had to be physically shattered. Stripped of their heavy combat bulldozers and specialized armored clearing vehicles, the surviving elements of the American combat engineer battalions were forced to rely on these simple, brutal tools. A Bangalore torpedo was essentially a series of 5-foot-long, interlocking steel tubes, densely packed with high explosives. As the remnants of leaderless infantry squads provided whatever sparse covering fire they could muster from behind the seawall, individual combat engineers began the agonizingly slow, incredibly exposed process of assembling the tubes. Lying flat in the wet, shifting sand, constantly bracketed by mortar fire and sweeping machine gun tracers, they meticulously threaded the steel sections together. They then shoved the elongated pipe directly underneath the coiled steel wire, pushing it deeper into the obstacle matrix. When the friction igniter was pulled, the resulting detonation was deafening, but it did not create a wide, triumphant avenue of advance. The explosive shockwave simply shattered the immediate vicinity of the heavy-gauge steel wire, instantly vaporizing the metallic coils and leaving behind a smoking, blackened crater in the sand. The blast created a microscopic, one-man-wide funnel through the barrier. It was a terrifyingly narrow, highly exposed path, but it fundamentally altered the physics of the battlefield. The physical cage holding the Americans on the beach had been cracked. Through these tiny, smoking breaches, small bands of combat engineers, followed closely by desperate infantrymen, began to slide through the wire. They left the relative safety of the shingle embankment and began to infiltrate the dead zones, the steep, heavily mined, brush-covered slopes located directly between the heavily fortified German concrete strongpoints. The static defense was still firing out to sea, but the attackers were beginning to move vertically, slipping beneath the primary arcs of fire. As these small, isolated groups began their arduous, dangerous climb up the bluffs, they desperately needed heavy fire support to suppress the concrete bunkers above them. With the Army's artillery resting at the bottom of the English Channel, that support came from a highly unorthodox, wildly dangerous maneuver by the United States Navy. Miles offshore, the captains of the American destroyer Screen were observing the unfolding disaster through their optical rangefinders. They could see the invasion timetable collapsing. They could see the infantry pinned and the armor sinking. Operating largely on their own localized initiative, several destroyer commanders made a radical decision that broke completely with standard naval doctrine. They ordered their helmsmen to steer their multi-million-dollar warships away from the designated deep-water bombardment areas and directly toward the treacherous, uncharted shallows of the Normandy coastline. Ships like the USS Frankfurt, the USS Carmick, and the USS McCook deliberately scraped the sandy bottom of the channel, risking catastrophic grounding to close the distance. They maneuvered so close to the shoreline that they were well within the lethal range of the German coastal artillery, exposing their unarmored hulls to direct, point-blank return fire. Reaching ranges as close as 1,000 yards, the destroyers brought their primary batteries, rapid-firing 5-inch 38-caliber guns, to bear directly on the cliff face. Because of the extreme proximity, the naval gunners did not have to calculate complex, plunging parabolic trajectories. They depressed their massive gun barrels to near horizontal angles, effectively using their warships as point-blank sniper rifles against the German fortifications. The impact of this direct naval gunfire was immediately transformative. High explosive shells slammed directly into the thick concrete embrasures of the Widerstandsnester, while the heavy reinforced concrete of the Atlantic Wall was largely designed to withstand aerial bombing. The continuous, rapid-fire concussive force of the 5-inch shells was devastating. The impacts created massive internal spalling, sending lethal chunks of jagged concrete flying inward, heavily suppressing the German gun crews and forcing them to abandon their firing slits. But the most critical damage inflicted by the destroyers was not the destruction of the concrete itself. It was the catastrophic disruption of the earth around it. The heavy naval shells churned the bluffs, uprooting trees, triggering landslides, and, most importantly, severing the deep network of buried telephone cables. The entire German defensive doctrine at Omaha Beach relied on a highly integrated, centralized nervous system. The coastal bunkers were not designed to fight autonomously. They were designed to serve as forward observation posts, calling in precise, coordinated fire missions from heavy artillery batteries located miles inland. By tearing up the earth and shredding the communication wires, the American naval bombardment effectively severed the optic nerve of the Atlantic Wall. The towering radio antennas attached to the command bunkers were simultaneously sheared off by the relentless shrapnel. Suddenly, the highly organized, interconnected German defense grid shattered. Wen 62 could no longer communicate with Wen 61. The forward observers could no longer reach the inland artillery commanders to adjust their fire onto the newly formed American breaches. The centralized command structure evaporated, leaving each individual bunker entirely blind to the broader tactical picture, forced to fight a disconnected, isolated battle for its own immediate survival. The lethal, synchronized machine of the Atlantic Wall had been violently downgraded into a series of uncoordinated, standalone concrete islands. This severe communication blackout immediately precipitated a massive, fatal failure in the German High Command miles inland. At the headquarters of the 352nd Infantry Division, General Dietrich Kreis and his senior staff officers were operating in a dangerous, localized vacuum of information. Stripped of their dedicated telephone lines, the division commanders were forced to rely on sporadic, delayed visual reports filtering back from the few observation posts that still had a functioning line of sight to the waterline. When these rear echelon officers looked through their powerful binocular lenses from the high ground, they saw a battlefield that perfectly matched their pre-invasion expectations. They saw a shoreline utterly choked with the burning wreckage of amphibious landing craft. They saw thousands of American soldiers effectively paralyzed behind the seawall, seemingly incapable of advancing. They saw a vast armada of equipment bogged down in the surf. Interpreting this chaotic tableau strictly through the rigid lens of their static defense doctrine, the German command drew a logical but catastrophically flawed conclusion. They believed the Atlantic Wall had performed exactly as engineered. They believed the primary American assault had been completely broken and suffocated on the beach. This incredibly dangerous misinterpretation was rapidly formalized and transmitted up the chain of command, solidifying a false narrative that the invasion in this sector had been successfully halted at the water's edge. This illusion of a decisive victory ensured that the most potent weapon in the German arsenal remained completely paralyzed. Positioned several miles inland, hidden among the Norman hedgerows, was Kampfgruppe Meyer, the highly mobile, dedicated armored reserve force of the 352nd Division. This specialized battle group, equipped with mechanized infantry and self-propelled assault guns, was the designated counterpunch of the coastal defense. Their strict operational purpose was to wait for the critical moment of the invasion, rapidly deploy toward the coast, and violently seal any localized breach, physically pushing the attackers back into the sea before a permanent beachhead could be established. They were fueled, armed, and standing by, waiting for the authorization to move. If Kampfgruppe Meyer had been unleashed down the primary ravines toward Colville or Vierville during those chaotic mid-morning hours, they would have crashed directly into the exhausted, disorganized bands of American infiltrators, easily crushing the fragile incursions and sealing the microscopic gaps in the wire. But the order to counterattack never came, because the blinded divisional headquarters firmly believed that the static coastal defenses had already won the battle. Kampfgruppe Meyer was deliberately held in place. They were kept miles away from the crisis point, entirely neutralized not by Allied firepower, but by a catastrophic lack of accurate intelligence. The rigid, uncompromising nature of the German doctrine demanded that local reserve commanders wait for explicit, centralized authorization before committing their forces, and that centralized authority was currently operating on a comfortable, fatal illusion of total victory. Miles away from the command desks, beneath the heavy, drifting canopy of artillery smoke, the reality of the battlefield was quietly, methodically slipping away from the defenders. The German High Command was busy formalizing a triumph that no longer existed in physical reality. The impregnable concrete fortresses of the Atlantic Wall were still standing, their heavy guns still dutifully pouring fire out toward the empty landing craft bobbing in the English Channel. But the invisible, integrated network that made those fortresses lethal had been fundamentally severed, and through the narrow, smoking, microscopic gaps blown in the rusted barbed wire, small, determined bands of desperate men were no longer looking backward at the sea. They had turned their backs to the water, and they were beginning to climb. This catastrophic failure of communication and the subsequent paralysis of the German armored reserve fundamentally fractured the reality of the battle, creating a profound historical blind spot that persists to this day. When examining the collapse of Omaha Beach, post-war popular history has heavily gravitated toward a hyper-focused, singular narrative, the myth of the lone, invincible machine gunner. Accounts often fixate entirely on individuals like Heinrich Severloh inside WN-62, attributing to him a staggering, almost mythological thousands of individual kills. This narrative construct is seductive because it offers a simple, brutal explanation for the American casualties. It paints a picture of a massive, heroic but inherently doomed frontal assault directly into the teeth of an unstoppable mechanical meat grinder. However, this intense focus on the frontal kill zones obscures the true tactical reality of how the Atlantic Wall actually fell. The defensive line was not ultimately broken by a massive wave of infantry charging straight into the muzzles of the MG-42s. That tactic had been violently suffocated in the surf hours earlier. Instead, the true turning point of the invasion occurred in the blind spots, the steep, brush-covered, smoke-filled ravines located immediately between the concrete strongpoints. While the German heavy weapons remained largely fixated horizontally along the beach, pouring fire into the wreckage below, they were physically incapable of aiming vertically down their own cliffs. The small, isolated bands of American survivors who had blown microscopic gaps in the wire were actively exploiting this critical engineering flaw. They were not fighting the concrete bunkers head-on. They were systematically bypassing them. By infiltrating through the draws and scaling the bluffs in the dead space between the intersecting arcs of fire, the Americans fundamentally inverted the tactical dynamic. The static, reinforced concrete that was designed to be the German defenders' greatest advantage suddenly transformed into a fatal, localized trap. The Widerstandsnester, heavily fortified against a frontal naval assault, were structurally blind to an enemy slowly creeping up behind them, severing their last remaining connections to the inland reserves. By early afternoon, the tactical reality inside the Widerstandsnester violently inverted. The German garrisons, still intently focused on the carnage along the shoreline, suddenly found themselves fighting a completely different battle. The heavy concrete walls that had protected them from naval bombardment were entirely useless against an enemy that had already bypassed them. The bunkers of the Atlantic Wall were heavily armored facing the sea, but their rear entrances, communication trenches, and ventilation shafts were dangerously exposed, designed only to connect to the supposedly secure inland reserves. When small groups of American infantry, covered in the gray mud and chalk dust of the bluffs, crested the ridge, they did not charge the firing slits. They systematically dismantled the strongpoints from the blind side. Inside WN-62, the claustrophobic terror of this realization took hold. Lieutenant Bernhard Ferking and his men, including Heinrich Severloh, had exhausted nearly all of their tens of thousands of rounds of machine gun ammunition. The deafening roar of their own weapons, which had defined the morning, was replaced by a terrifying, localized silence. Then came the distinct, metallic clatter of American fragmentation grenades dropping directly into the bunker's narrow concrete ventilation shafts. The concussive blasts within the enclosed spaces were instantly incapacitating. Outside the casemates, the open-air communication trenches that linked the machine gun nests to the ammunition bunkers became lethal traps. American troops began hurling white phosphorus grenades over the earthen berms. The chemical payload ignited instantly upon contact with the air, flooding the zigzagging trench lines with thick, suffocating clouds of heavy, blinding smoke. The German defenders, choking and disoriented, were physically flushed out of their fortified positions. The geometry of the kill zone had fundamentally flipped. The hunters were now trapped inside their own engineered labyrinth. Realizing they were completely surrounded, entirely cut off from the paralyzed 352nd Division headquarters, and devoid of any remaining ammunition to sustain the defense, the surviving garrison commanders faced a stark binary choice. There would be no heroic last stand, authorized by a high command that still mistakenly believed the beach was secure. At WN-62, Frerking ordered the position abandoned. The remaining defenders scrambled out of the concrete complexes and attempted to flee south into the hedgerows, only to be intercepted, captured, or killed by the American infantry securing the high ground. The men they were forced to surrender to were the exact same men they believed they had eradicated in the surf just hours before. By the time the afternoon tide rolled in to wash away the burning wreckage on the sand, the heavy guns overlooking the Colville draw had finally gone silent. The unprecedented slaughter on the beach was over, but Hitler's impenetrable fortress had not been crushed by a massive frontal assault. It had fallen from the inside out. Standing inside the suddenly quiet, smoking concrete shell of Widerstandsnest 62 by late afternoon, the view through the narrow embrasure revealed a fundamentally altered reality. The tide had receded, leaving behind a sprawling graveyard of the initial assault. Yet, flowing directly through that wreckage, completely unhindered by artillery or interlocking machine gun fire, was a massive, unstoppable artery of Allied reinforcements and heavy machinery pouring onto the continent. The Atlantic Wall had performed exactly as its engineers had intended. It had successfully intercepted a highly predictable, tightly structured frontal assault and inflicted catastrophic damage upon it. It had shattered the American operational timetable, drowned the amphibious armor, and systematically pinned the first waves against the seawall. But the total collapse of that Allied invasion plan is precisely what triggered the fatal unraveling of the German defense. The rigid, static architecture of the Atlantic Wall and the deeply centralized command doctrine that governed it was structurally incapable of processing chaos. Hitler's coastal fortress was built to fight a synchronized, predictable military machine, not a highly decentralized swarm of desperate individuals fighting strictly for their own survival. While German division commanders miles inland remained paralyzed, waiting for functioning telephone lines and formal authorization to release their armored reserves, small bands of combat engineers and infantrymen were aggressively rewriting the tactical reality in real time. They completely abandoned their assigned objectives, improvised with the few explosives they had managed to carry ashore, and ruthlessly exploited the microscopic engineering flaws in the concrete line. The breakthrough at Omaha Beach proved that even the most formidable technological fortresses are inherently fragile when localized human adaptation drastically outpaces centralized military doctrine. Ultimately, the perfect defense was dismantled, not by a superior operational blueprint, but by the unscripted, violent initiative of the men who survived when the blueprint failed. The defenders of the Atlantic Wall spent the entire morning peering through their concrete embraces, absolutely convinced they were watching the Allied invasion bleed out in the surf. They had placed their faith in a rigid architecture of interlocking fire, trusting that the shoreline would serve as an inescapable tomb for the American assault. But as afternoon shadows lengthened across Normandy, the isolated German garrisons confronted a quiet, terrifying reality. The army they believed they had annihilated at the water's edge had not died in the sand, but had simply bypassed their heavy guns, scaled the bluffs, and marched inland to take the continent.